first, I want to say thank you everyone for attending the second day of the Willamette Law Review Housing Land Advocates Symposium. My name is Mark Hansen. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Willamette Law Review, and my colleagues and I are very excited to host this symposium along with the housing land advocates. We're going to follow the same format as we did yesterday. Each panelist will give his or her presentation, and then the remaining time will be devoted to panel discussion and answers to your questions. So please submit any questions that you do have during the course of either the presentations or during the cross-panel discussion in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The panel moderator, Professor Diller, has kindly volunteered to moderate both panels today. The panel moderator will then go through those questions and pose them to the panelists as part of the discussion. Additionally, yesterday, panelists spent part of the break directly answering any remaining questions, so they might spend some time doing that as well. With that, I don't have any more notes. I'm very excited to get this started. So I'd like to introduce Professor Paul Diller, who is moderating the first panel.
Thank you, Mark, and good morning to our attendees, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever it is you are in the world. Our first panel today is entitled HUD in the Age of Biden, HUD being the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And that reminds me, I attended a conference on housing a year ago where the facilitator said, you know, in housing law, people tend to use a lot of jargon and acronyms. And so if the panelists or I or anybody mentions an acronym you don't know, feel free to throw that in the Q&A as well. I'm going to introduce our speakers in the order in which they'll be speaking. First, we have Noëlle Porter, Director of Government Affairs at the National Housing Law Project in Washington, D.C., joining us. Second, we'll have David Dworkin, President and CEO of the National Housing Conference, also joining us from Washington, D.C. And third, we'll have Karlo Ng, Director of Legal Initiatives at the National Alliance for Safe Housing. She, like many of us, is on the West Coast today, joining us from Berkeley, California. Each panelist will speak for approximately 15 minutes. You may hear me pipe up just to give them a reminder of the time. And then we'll move on to Q&A and cross-panel discussion. So with no further ado, I'll hand it over to Noëlle.
Thank you so much, Professor Diller. So full disclosure, I am not an attorney. And so my job at the National Housing Law Project, we have about, 13 to 14 expert attorneys on staff dedicated to different areas of housing law. We represent a network of almost 1,600 legal aid attorneys practicing housing law across the country. And my job is to take all of the brilliance of the work that they do and translate it into Hill speak for interns and young staff on Capitol Hill and working with HUD and the administration as well. So I wanted to sort of set the broad stage or the sort of umbrella conversation about this new administration and this new Congress. You'll often hear me refer to the 117th Congress. That is this chunk of 2 years that we're in. And the different ways that those two entities, those two bodies will play together and how the priorities of both will sort of kind of chug forward, and where there is room for advocacy, where there is room for excellent housing work. From our perspective at the National Housing Law Project, room to remember that tenants are at the center of housing discussions, and that we're really working to advocate for a more equitable housing system. So I wanted to start with the Biden-Harris plan, the administration's Build Back Better initiative, and just sort of hit on some of the spaces in which housing is a key component of the White House's administrative priorities for the four years of this term. So obviously, I think, if you have Twitter or the news or, been wearing a mask for a year, you know that the administration is heavily committed to ending the COVID-19 pandemic, and to dealing with the economic fallout from the pandemic. And so obviously, maybe not, obviously, the Congress has been laser focused in the early parts of this new administration and new Congress on a relief package. Actually, as we speak, the Senate is in 20 hours of legislative debate over the relief package. For huge nerds, you may know this is a reconciliation bill, which means it's a manipulation of the budget, and it has strict rules for what is allowed within the final text. But it also means in a reconciliation package that it only needs 51 votes to pass. And so with a 50-50 split in the Senate and the vice president's tie-breaking vote, the Democrats anticipate being able to pass what looks to be about a $1.9 trillion package, although I know there's been some spending cuts and reserves on both sides. And so we'll see the final total as we sort of get through this. But the relief package for housing specifically contains a number of spending items. I would call them provisions, but we really don't get to do work here. We can only spend or reduce. And so importantly, there are, I'm going to get the numbers wrong. I read this bill last night, so I just won't say them, but there are a number of billions in, maybe David Dworkin jumps in to tell us, for rental assistance. I believe this one's at like 19.05 billion in rental assistance specifically, or we'll call it ERAP, moving forward, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. Those dollars have been designated through the Treasury, the Department of the Treasury, as individual assistance. And that puts some tough sort of things into play, right? HUD has a tenant focus when they spend dollars. And so when they're delivering funds to individuals, they're working to make sure that it is sort of a streamlined process between all of the different players that they have. HUD is in connection with landlords, et cetera. Treasury is doling these dollars out to states in some localities, and then they award the money to grantees to target the hardest hit and those with the most need in their communities. This is technically a fourth round of rental assistance that will come from the administration. The first was administered almost entirely through HUD, and then we sort of moved into this Treasury practice. And what's been really remarkable about the development of this relief has been that the White House has been very focused, and you'll see this theme throughout, on convening all of the relevant parties. So working to make sure that HUD gets to tell Treasury what you need to do when you're trying to target tenants and when you're looking at low-income persons. I will say from an NHLP perspective, we're not convinced they're getting it all right, but they're getting closer than they could have without this sort of broad input. The convening of all parties also means that they're engaging the National Economic Council. I think that's a huge signal from the White House to say to the country that housing is an economic issue. And I don't know that we've ever had that sort of explicit tied connection. We sort of say, like, we have an economic crisis in the country, or we have a housing crisis in the country. And as we know from 2007, 2008, 2009, the two are the same. And they can't, you almost can't have one without the other. And we're going to trigger some real challenges on both sides, depending on what's happening. And we have a rental crisis in this country right now. And we're on the cusp of rental crises if we don't continue to do the work that we're doing to keep folks housed safely. And so engaging the National Economic Council, using the White House Domestic Policy Council, bringing Treasury to the table with HUD, those are a real signal that the White House is saying, we see this as a broad-based national problem, not sort of an individual problem for poor tenants who are struggling. The other major part of this sort of COVID-19 push in terms of housing is a moratorium on rental evictions. And there's some work in the ownership space as well, moratorium on foreclosures and other issues. Folks might know that the moratorium that we have that was issued during the Trump administration came out of the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. The reason for that being that the Centers for Disease Control, or really HHS, or Health and Human Services broadly, has the authority to say we have a public health emergency and we can take measures to stop the spread of the disease, or to stop the outbreak of the, let's say we have an E. coli problem. And what we have been able to prove is that evictions are directly connected to the ability to to control the spread of the virus, and that the higher rates of evictions in certain communities have led to a much more virus spread. So the CDC stepped in with its authority to create a moratorium on evictions. It's imperfect. It will not show up in the relief package. It's ineligible for legislative text under the reconciliation process. I have a feeling I'm generating a number of questions here. And so the administration, we've been working very closely with the administration to ensure that they extend the moratorium beyond what is currently a March 31st end date. That's not the term I was looking for, but it works. And we're also working to see that they improve it. And we're working, as I said, on the premise that that this is a public health issue and a public health order. I'm not going to go into it, but I have a question folks might be interested, or an inkling folks might be interested. There was a recent case in Texas. The Turkle decision from one judge indicated that the moratorium was unconstitutional on the basis of the Commerce Clause. Interestingly, it did not involve an injunction, so the order is not stayed. But, you know, there are a number of really sort of interesting things at play in the way that the judge made the decision, and, you know, from NHLP's perspective, sort of was bonkers. And so if folks are kind of interested, you know, we could do it during the discussion, or we could chat about it after. You know, moving through now the Build Back Better initiative, one of the things I think is interesting is that climate is obviously a top priority for this administration as well. I say obviously a lot, and I have to remember that this is where I stay, and I'm glad to be sharing this with all of you. So I apologize if I'm taking stuff for granted. One of the things you may have heard in the last Congress was a Green New Deal for housing, really kind of like a revolutionary overhaul of the federal housing systems in an attempt to make new jobs and new efforts at development, but to greenify those efforts and to ensure that we're really making an impact from a climate perspective. The only thing I'll say there is we know that radical change comes with unintended consequences, and that oftentimes we realize it's time for an overhaul, it's time for a new idea, and we lose some things in the process. And so for us, we want to say to climate organizers, to climate activists and advocates, that tenants could end up being sort of a byproduct of environmental overhaul of development. And we really want to make sure that there are dedicated tenant protections as we greenify, upgrade, make new developments, to ensure that folks get to stay in their homes and get to stay in their communities and get to enjoy, you know, let's say the building takes massive utilities cuts, or receives massive utilities cuts after upgrading to, say, solar. Those benefits should come to the tenant as well. There should be a reduction in utilities fees, et cetera. Paul,
5 minutes to go.
Awesome. I have a million notes here on racial equity. I know David's really going to dive into it, and so I'll use that to take back some of my time. But I will mention that through a sort of wonky little process, the last administration retracted the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing rule. We have an obligation, I would say a moral mandate, to reinstate that rule. There's some discussion around DC about whether or not we would even make improvements in the process. I want to note that as Biden indicates an effort to really scale up on vouchers and to make housing something for all, that we can't let anti-poverty interventions act as a proxy for anti-racist policy. We have to make sure that we don't say, if we're helping poor people, we're helping Black people, that we have a real dedication to anti-racism in a specific way and to advancing equity. And oftentimes that means going further or affirmatively furthering policies that make up for really past racial issues. And then, you know, this is a huge pet issue of the vice president's, but homeownership and the racial wealth gap is something I think we'll see a lot of dedication from the administration. Finally, the economic growth and stabilization for the country is a huge policy priority. And as I said at the top, the administration seems to be indicating in every sort of pocket that they understand that housing, that the renter crisis, that our already existing deep rent burden prior to the crisis, and our already existing evictions crisis are key parts of economic recovery, and we'll show some commitment there. At HUD, it's important to note we are waiting on the confirmation of a secretary whose hearing was on, I believe, February 7th. She was confirmed pretty widely by the Banking Committee and the Senate, and is still not the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. To that end, we do not have an announcement about any of her undersecretaries. But I think that, her commitment, again, going to the racial equity, her commitment historically to civil rights and to racial equity is going to be a huge asset to the administration. A few other notes on the staffing, and I know David's going to get into this more broadly. The HUD has hired a senior advisor on rental assistance. That's a huge deal. That's not a position that had existed previously, and again shows how committed they are to this current crisis. It's Peggy Bailey. She was previously at the Center on Budget Policy Priorities, incredible anti-racist advocate and incredible expert on rental assistance and housing writ large. They've also indicated that the budget will be a huge deal by hiring a new senior advisor there, meaning that I think we might see some spending on HUD, and I'm here for it. We are strapped. And then housing finance, and I think David can talk to that a lot, that they're indicating that supply is something that the administration is willing to focus on. Obviously, HUD will have a commitment to the reversal of previous policies out of the administration prior, including AFFH, the disparate impact rule. We saw a few other small successes in preventing implementation of a few others. But there's a lot of regulatory reform that happened kind of quietly, as well as the big stuff. 1 minute. I thought this was going to take me 7. Apparently I can talk. I will say this. Legislatively, there's something a little bit up in the air in how we understand that this Congress might work. In the previous Congress, the House was the Democratic majority. They had a Republican Senate. It was important to indicate that they were working. They put every bill on the floor. They voted every bill through. We had big ideas. We had small ideas. We had lots of housing law coming up for votes. They have to be a little more withholding now, a little more detail oriented. They have to coordinate with the Senate to try to accomplish some things. And so we'll see, I'd hope, more attention to detail on policy, but maybe less of the everything we ever wanted is passing the House day by day by day. Senator Sherrod Brown will be the chair of the Banking Committee, which handles all HUD issues. We've never seen him act as chair. We have to learn how often he has hearings, how often he has committee votes. And Senator Schumer will have his first opportunity to be the majority leader. Again, we called Mitch McConnell the graveyard because we didn't see many Senate floor votes. I don't necessarily anticipate that we'll see daily floor votes on legislation from Senator Schumer. So what will it look like to sort of make this transition? But I will say that the first-year calendar is stacked. We will vote for this COVID infrastructure package this week, or this COVID package this weekend. The administration is showing that infrastructure is the next big priority. We're hoping housing is always a part of that conversation. That's for David. You've seen H.R. 1 pass the House. That's the major democracy reform bill, as well as the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Both of those hopefully will take up oxygen in the Senate, whether or not they're viable. We want to hear hearings. We want to see markups. We want to have these discussions. And then we have to get fiscal year 2022 appropriations done. And so that doesn't leave a lot of space for us to have major legislative gains. So I would say focusing on, as we continue this conversation, the spaces where regulatory change and advancement is possible, and using this really important moment where HUD might be recognized at the table as a major player in our economy and in our efforts to recover, et cetera, is going to be key. And I will add to that major legislative council that Karlo is going to speak about, BAWA, as we wrap up. Did I do it?
Great. Yes, thank you. Excellent. Thanks so much, Noëlle. And continuing on with more about what we can expect to see from HUD in the Biden administration is David Dworkin.
Thanks, Paul, and thank you, Noëlle. You did nail the number on rental assistance. It's just under $20 billion in the second tranche, $25 billion in the first tranche, which is already working its way through the system. It's frustrating that it's not moving faster. but it's a lot to put together a $25 billion rental assistance program from scratch, and that's distributed through all of the states and many large counties and cities throughout the country. So hopefully we will see a lot more progress there. I do want to make one point about the HUD Secretary's confirmation. I have spent some time with Secretary-designate Fudge. I'm very excited about her leadership at HUD. I think that she's going to bring some fresh perspective because she has not been as deeply immersed in all of these issues. She also has a lifetime of advocacy on behalf of home funds and was the mayor of a predominantly African-American inner ring suburb in Cleveland, as well as representing Cleveland and Akron in Congress. So she has a lot of very valuable perspective, and I'm looking forward to her being briefed by her staff and frequently asking the question, and why exactly do you do it that way? I think it's going to be very helpful. Her confirmation is not delayed because of any problems in the Senate, because the majority is so narrow in the House. The preference has been to hold her vote as long as possible. And so while her confirmation is not held up, I think that it will be able to move much quicker now that the House has passed the reconciliation bill, goes to the Senate. Once that's disposed of, I expect her confirmation will come forthwith. Noëlle's right, two most important positions that need to be decided, hopefully as soon as she gets there. The Deputy Secretary of HUD, this is a critical management role and leadership position throughout the building, and the FHA Commissioner, who's also the Assistant Secretary for Housing. And I think we'll, looking forward to that. I think it's going to be, these are very critical jobs. Another job that's incredibly important in terms of housing that's not in HUD is the Controller of the Currency at OCC. This is an area that's kind of fallen into some controversy around between progressives and pragmatists, and who's more pragmatic and who's more progressive and is the right candidate. I don't want to get into all the personnel issues around that, but I do believe strongly it's vitally important that the head of the OCC both be deeply committed to Community Reinvestment Act modernization, doing it the right way, which was, I don't think, the right case in the previous administration, as well as being a highly qualified prudential regulator. Because if the banks are in trouble, they're not investing in Community Reinvestment Act, although CRA is never an issue that puts the banks in trouble. So let's focus on HUD. I think that the issue around racial equity is clearly a major focus of this administration. There is also a significant focus around housing production. And much of the crisis in affordable housing is an issue of supply and demand. We simply are not building enough housing that's affordable to Americans at pretty much every income level except the very wealthy. And so I think many of us know middle income and upper middle income families who have kids living at home because they're in hot job markets and can't find a place to live. If that's the case for people making six figures a year, you can imagine how much worse it is as you move further down the economic spectrum. And we've got to address this by building more housing. This is also where the continuum between home ownership and rental comes into play. If you have fewer homeowners, you have more renters. The law of supply and demand is never repealed. And so we have got to address that. That's going to be a very high priority for the secretary, and she's very aware of that. On racial equity, one of the favorite things I like to quote is a section in Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, when Mike Campbell is asked how he went bankrupt. And his answer is two ways: gradually and suddenly. And I think that's what we've seen in racial equity this year, over the past year. There has been a fundamental shift in our understanding nationally and among major organizations in housing as well, around issues around racial equity, and an understanding that equality and equity are not the same thing. And so in the past, I would say 6 months, in the wake of the George Floyd murder, what we've seen is major housing organizations really embracing this concept. In the case of the National Association of Realtors, making some really historic statements about their historic role in racial segregation, as well as historic new commitments around issues like disparate impact. And I like to think about the issue of disparate impact pretty simply, like if you have a child who knocks over a family heirloom, the first thing they often will say is, "I didn't mean it." It doesn't change the fact that the vase is broken. It doesn't change the fact that they're responsible for breaking the vase, or that as a parent, you're responsible for not having put it in a safe place. And when we look at the impact of racial discrimination as opposed to the intent, it's very much similar. We really have to think of this in terms of, okay, it may not be my fault personally, but observing it and seeing its actual impact, what am I doing about that? And if I choose to say I'm not going to do anything about that, then this is circled back to what's my role. And I think this is really underneath all the legal language, this is the fundamental foundation of what they call the disparate impact rule, which was written by the Obama administration after a generation of delay, and was then thrown out and rewritten, really gutted by the Trump administration, and now is going to have to be addressed again. Another key rule that comes out of the Fair Housing Act is the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing rule. This is another one. It's a little more complicated than disparate impact. Most of the major housing organizations that would have been reluctant to support disparate impact are now on board, and there's much broader agreement. It's pretty impressive. You see organizations like the Mortgage Bankers Association and the National Association of Realtors and others really understanding and articulating a much more progressive, for lack of a better word, position on disparate impact. I see Noëlle nodding, I agree. And on affirmatively furthering fair housing, I think the issue often comes down to how are you defining that? What is in the plan that's required? We get much more into the nitty gritty. Is the list of things that have to be reported the right list? Are there regulatory burdens there? I think there's broad agreement on most of the items. There may be room for revisitation of some of them in consultation with local housing providers and local governments. But I do think that everybody agrees that the Trump administration gutted this rule, and that it's critical that it be re-implemented and rewritten. On the broader issue of particularly Black homeownership, and I think it's important for us to keep in mind that there is a fundamental difference in the experience of Black homeowners over the last 10 to 12 years than any other racial or ethnic group, not just because they had the steepest decline, but also because they've continued to decline over the course of the recovery. And today, Black homeownership is lower than it was in 1968 when housing discrimination was still legal. And that's a really stunning indictment. We made a lot of progress. Clearly, it was not sustainable progress. And so there's a keen interest in trying to address this, in part because if we don't do anything, the projections are that Black homeownership will actually continue to go down, settle at around 41%, which puts you roughly equivalent to the year I was born. I will not say what that was, but it was before 1968. And it will stay there until the year 2040. And so what we have done is helped put together a Black homeownership collaborative of major housing organizations, as well as the NAACP and the National Urban League, to develop a multi-point plan to create 3 million net new homeowners by 2030. That's a big stretch, and it would raise the Black homeownership rate to something over 50%, probably in the 52 to 54% range. This is something that is really important to the current administration, as well as to the committees on the Hill, and it includes a variety of mechanisms. One of the most interesting, and one that Chairwoman Waters is keenly interested in, and actually already moving forward on in draft, is how to do really comprehensive down payment assistance. And one of the things that's most important in terms of HUD's programs and in other efforts to deal with racial equity is that we have used a surrogate, a legal surrogate, for racial equity using low and moderate income census tracts or low and moderate income people. And it is incredibly inaccurate and has not been effective. And so what we're looking at in this context is a couple of ways to really focus that better in the future that remains consistent with the Fair Housing Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. This involves focusing on first generation home buyers as opposed to first time home buyers. When we look at first time home buyers, we're focusing on among economically disadvantaged groups. And so a number of smart lawyers in Washington have created this concept of how to really focus without basically running afoul of the Fair Housing Act, but better targeting people of color and focusing on those with an area median income of less than 120%, but for high cost areas up to 180, and also incorporating pre-purchase counseling and requiring so-called qualified mortgages, which basically means mortgages that aren't predatory. I think that's going to be a really exciting area. The other thing I want to say about HUD is the importance of staffing. HUD's overall staff is about 25% less than it was in 2009. That's a devastating impact on every single program. And so hiring both political appointees, but especially civil servants, is going to be a critical area. And if you have remotely interested in working for HUD, you should be checking the USA Jobs site, putting in a plug for usajobs.gov. But it is, there are a lot of positions that need to be filled, including civil service positions. I'm hoping some Schedule A subject matter experts, and there are plenty of political appointment available as well. If you're interested in serving as a political appointee, you got to go on the website and give them your resume. Otherwise, you know, there's nothing to talk about. The last thing I'll say is that is the issue around housing choice vouchers. And I think housing choice voucher reform is going to also be really important. We don't have enough of them, but more importantly, we don't have enough units that take them. And so when you look at the housing choice voucher program, for instance, the wait list in the District of Columbia to get a voucher for affordable housing is more than 10 years. If you're homeless, it's probably closer to 2. That's 2 years of being homeless before you're even likely to get a housing voucher. That's a devastating failure, and it needs more than just more money, although it does need more money. We also need to look at source of income discrimination. And then finally, I would add that whenever you think about HUD, you have to recognize that the vast majority of major funding for housing programs is actually outside of HUD. So much of housing policy is run out of Treasury. And just to name a few, you've got, of course, the mortgage interest deduction, which is managed by the IRS. But setting that completely aside and all the controversy around that, and I am a big supporter of the mortgage interest deduction, you have the low-income housing tax credit, which is the most effective and impactful producer of low-income housing in the country. I think that you also have the CDFI fund. You have the current rental assistance and homeowner assistance that's being proposed to go through Treasury. The Capital Magnet Fund, which just got an influx of $383 million. The Housing Trust Fund, which while it's run by HUD, it's really just a conduit for funds to the states. That's another $700+ million. And I think it's really important for us to keep in mind that one of the key priorities of HUD is going to make HUD more central to housing policy. And one of the reasons why policymakers in Congress often like to put money through Treasury is they are concerned about the capacity and the bureaucracy at HUD. And so fixing that is also going to be, I think, high on the list of priorities for the new HUD secretary. And then that really kind of sums it up. If there are other areas, I guess the one other thing that I would note is that one of the most important and powerful positions in the government on housing is the head of the Federal Housing Finance Agency. That position is being really argued in the courts right now, and we may see a change there in June or July. But it's another area where housing policy really is centralized outside of the building of HUD. So with that, thanks for having me, and I'm looking forward to hearing what others have to say.
Thank you, David. And just to the audience, I do see the questions coming in, and I'll keep looking at them, so please keep them coming. There is one question for you, David, asking for the name of the Black Homeownership Collaborative that you referred to and a website for that effort. So I guess you could tell us the name now, and if you could type the website into the chat or something so folks can find it if there is a website.
I cannot.
Okay.
It is an effort that's been a collaboration that's been going on pretty much behind the scenes. We're actually just focusing on refining our plan and then briefing the White House, Treasury, HUD, and the key committees. There will be a public announcement. We have had 5 work streams that have been working on the major areas of this that have come up with what is now in draft a 7-point plan. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out what would be the goal, and came up with a stretch goal that we thought would be meaningful, but also a genuine stretch that would have a material impact. I will tell you that the National Fair Housing Alliance, the National Fair Housing Alliance, the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, the realtors, the mortgage bankers, ourselves, the NAACP, and the National Urban League, as well as the Urban Institute, are all part of this collaborative, as well as many, many other organizations that are part of the bigger group.
Great, thanks. And I see that first question. We'll get to that after our next panelist, and that is Karlo Ng.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen here, see if that works, and then I have some slides I'd like to share. So hopefully, can you all see the slides? Thumbs up.
We can see it.
Great. Okay, so hi everyone, my name is Karlo Ng. I'm Director of Legal Initiatives at the National Alliance for Safe Housing, or NASH for short. So NASH is a nonprofit that works nationally as well as with local communities on changing systems and policies to create safe housing options for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. We also provide trainings and technical assistance to housing providers and survivor advocates across the country on safe housing issues. So if you want to learn more, our website is there, and that's my email address, so feel free to email me. We're going to pivot a little bit from sort of the more macro policy overview to focus more on housing protections for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And I'll talk generally about what HUD has done and has not done, as well as other federal agencies in this area. So as many of you know, President Biden has been a huge champion of protecting and ensuring the rights of survivors. That is what led him to write the Violence Against Women Act that was enacted in 1994, which we'll talk about today. And as vice president during the Obama administration, he created the first ever White House advisor position on violence against women. So since we have limited time, I'll go ahead and move forward with the slides. So that we're on the same page, folks should know that there is a very strong link between domestic and sexual violence and housing instability. When Congress included housing protections for the first time in the Violence Against Women Act, what it found was that 92% of homeless women have experienced severe physical or sexual abuse. Domestic violence survivors often return to abusive partners because they cannot find long-term housing. And so they often find themselves in this abusive and cyclical relationship where they're dependent on their survivors, and so they have to go back to them. Because abusers frequently manipulate finances to control partners, survivors often lack steady income, credit history, landlord references, and a current address, all of which you need to obtain long-term permanent housing. And then this is a separate study that was not part of Congress's findings for VAWA, but in this study, it found that there were some major problems among low-income women and their landlords, in terms of landlords committing sexual harassment and sexual abuse against low-income women in particular. And 90% of those individuals were women of color. So a little bit about the Violence Against Women Act. So VAWA was originally enacted in 1994. The housing protections, though, were included for the first time in 2005. They were significantly expanded in 2013 to include more protections as well as more coverage of federal housing programs. Generally speaking, the law provides housing safeguards for survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking who are applying for or living in federally assisted housing. So it is specifically focused on federally assisted housing. So VAWA does not apply in situations that involve regular market rate rental housing unless there's some kind of federal housing subsidy involved. And even though the Violence Against Women Act is called the Violence Against Women Act, the law applies to a survivor regardless of their gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, or age. There's a lot of text here. The major takeaway that I want you to have from this slide is that when we think about VAWA, for folks who sort of know a little bit about VAWA, people generally think like, oh, okay, it covers HUD programs. Yes, that's true. It covers a number of HUD programs. The list is there, public housing, Section 8, et cetera. However, it also covers a number of federally assisted housing units that are administered, the funding for which are administered by other agencies. So here you have the Department of Agriculture, which has an office called the Office of Rural Development that has a number of, provides federal assistance to a number of multifamily units across the country that is covered by VAWA. And then also the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, which David mentioned during his presentation, is the largest federal program that produces affordable housing for our country. So we're talking about a total of over 3 million units since the program's inception in the 1980s. And every year it's churning out 100,000 affordable housing units. So the tax credit program, which is run by Treasury, specifically the IRS, is a huge, huge, huge source of affordable housing for our country. And that program and the units are also covered by VAWA. This is a very quick list of the rights that survivors have under VAWA. It's not comprehensive. I just wanted to, again, give sort of folks a baseline knowledge of what rights survivors have in VAWA. So there's some general anti-discrimination protections. Survivors can't be denied admission. They cannot be evicted or have their assistance terminated because of the violence committed against them. They have the right to request for an emergency transfer if they no longer feel safe where they're living and they need to find alternative safe housing. They can request for what's called generally a lease bifurcation, basically for the abuser in the unit to be removed from the lease or the housing assistance, and then the survivor and whoever else is in the unit can stay in the unit and continue to receive the housing assistance. They also have a right to receive a VAWA housing rights notice so that they know what rights that they have. That's also true of applicants. Anyone who applies to these units should be getting a VAWA housing rights notice. There's also a strict right to confidentiality of information. So any information that a survivor provides to a housing provider to seek VAWA protections must be strictly confidential. And then they also have the ability to self-certify. If there is written proof that is requested from the housing provider that I understand you're seeking these protections and I need to see some proof from you. A survivor has the right to provide a self-certification form that's completed that comes from HUD. There's also other housing laws that apply when we're talking about housing protections for survivors. So I talked about the Violence Against Women Act, which, as I said, only applies in the federal housing programs context. There's also the Fair Housing Act, which has come up at various times in this talk today. The Fair Housing Act provides for a whole spectrum of protections for homeowners, renters, people who are seeking housing, and also the Fair Housing Act protects domestic violence survivors from discrimination when they're buying or renting housing, regardless of whether or not the housing is receiving any kind of financial assistance from the government. And that's really important because, like I mentioned before, VAWA only applies in situations where there's federal housing assistance. The Fair Housing Act applies more broadly. However, when you apply the Fair Housing Act to domestic violence survivors, the protection is more limited in the sense that because the Fair Housing Act doesn't explicitly say that domestic violence survivors are protected, the way that they're protected is through a gender discrimination theory. And the way that works is Statistically, most survivors are women. And because if you discriminate survivors, that would disproportionately impact women, that means that you're discriminating against women, which violates the Fair Housing Act. And that's how you get the prohibition against discrimination of domestic violence survivors. So as you might be thinking, that is not perfect, right? What about male survivors? What about survivors that identify as transgender? What about folks who are not in heterosexual relationships? And so all of those questions are coming up. They play out in court cases. It is not a perfect cover. It doesn't provide perfect coverage for domestic violence survivors. There's also a whole host of state and local laws that provide housing protections for survivors on the local level. Here we have some really helpful data and information from the National Housing Law Project's publication, their state law compendium about housing rights for domestic violence survivors. And so what we see is that these numbers are now higher. Thankfully, this information is a little bit dated. NHLP is in the process of updating the compendium. But what you see is that about half the states have early lease termination protections for survivors who need to get out of their unit and find alternative safe housing. About half the states also have eviction defense, so survivors cannot be evicted for the violence committed against them. About fewer than half have the ability, include laws that have the ability for survivors to change their locks if they need to do so for safety reasons. And then you have about 15 or so, again, this number is higher, for folks to protect folks who need to call 911 or seek emergency services in order to protect themselves as well. So we have all of these laws, federal, state, and local, that provide all these protections for survivors in the housing context. So what exactly is going on the ground? Well, what we're seeing is that there are still many, many challenges. So in June of last year, my organization conducted a survey asking advocates who work with survivors directly, advocates who work in the housing sector, advocates who work in the homelessness sector, what exactly are you seeing in terms of housing barriers for survivors who are experiencing domestic and sexual violence during the pandemic? And we received 110 responses from advocates, and it was a very, we had a very short limited period of time. It was only about a week that we opened up the survey. So the fact that we even got 110 responses was actually amazing. And this is what advocates reported. Advocates reported that landlords were screening survivors out when they were applying for housing if they had any kind of bad credit history, bad rental history, or criminal records related to the violence. Landlords were refusing to rent to survivors because they didn't want to sign lease addendums that involved VAWAs, and which is strange because just because you don't sign the VAWA lease addendum doesn't mean that you're not covered and that you don't have responsibilities as a housing provider under VAWA, but yet we continue to see this with lease addendums and landlords. Landlords were still evicting and threatening to evict survivors for reasons related to the violence committed against them. We often saw these in the form of property damage, where property damage was done because of domestic violence, and then they were charging and or evicting survivors because of the property damage, even though the damage was caused by the abusers. Survivors were also being evicted for calling the police. And then housing providers are also using tenant status as survivors and their inability to move because of the pandemic to threaten eviction when tenants express concerns about the habitability and maintenance of their apartments.
5 minutes.
Oh, thanks. So there are also some additional problems with language access. Many landlords thought that VAWA's protections were no longer in effect because VAWA hadn't been reauthorized, which is true. VAWA has not been reauthorized. However, the substantive housing protections continue to be on the books. So that's really, really important to remember. And that there are many, many problems with emergency transfers. Landlords are not responding to the requests. Many advocates and their survivors are not pursuing emergency transfer requests because they have found out, what's the point? No one's going to respond to us. We're never going to get anything. So what does this mean? It means that what we're seeing is that housing providers are not complying with their legal obligations. Tenants are not receiving the affirmative legal remedies that these laws were designed to provide for survivors. And so why is this happening, right? As policy people, I think, that are helping to get these laws enacted and written just the way that we want them, we are really frustrated to know, why is this happening? Well, some of it has to do with VAWA hasn't been fully implemented. HUD has been the agency that has most fully comprehensively implemented through regulations and guidance, but the other agencies in charge of administering these programs covered by VAWA have not done that. So rural development has some guidance, but no regulations. Treasury, including the ARS, has done nothing. So actually, if you want to learn more about sort of the tax credit program and how VAWA implementation has rolled out and what else needs to be done, please go to that website that we just launched, where we actually have a series of maps where we show you exactly how VAWA implementation has rolled out in the tax credit program across the country. There's no funding for training or support for housing providers who have lots of questions about how to do VAWA implementation. There's also no monitoring of compliance with VAWA for housing providers. And VAWA's coverage itself is limited, right? Like I mentioned, it only covers federal housing programs. The Fair Housing Act tries to fill the gap, but doesn't do a perfect job of doing that. So then what changes are needed? We desperately, desperately need more training and technical assistance for housing providers. That's the one thing that we keep on hearing on the ground, is that housing providers are not malicious. They don't know. If they don't know that they have these obligations under VAWA, even when they know they have these responsibilities, they don't truly understand how to make them practical. So they have an obligation to create an emergency transfer plan, but how do you make it operational? Given, especially in situations where the housing provider has a very limited portfolio of housing units, how do we make this work for the provider as well as the survivor? There's uneven VAWA implementation across all of the programs because of the federal agency's lack of implementation. So that needs to happen, is the even implementation. There needs to be stronger VAWA compliance oversight of housing providers. And there has to be more enforcement of VAWA as well as fair housing protections by federal agencies. And then finally, the Fair Housing Act must explicitly cover survivors. You know, using the gender discrimination theory is not a perfect fit. It doesn't help all survivors, and it leaves out a lot of survivors who don't fit that gender discrimination theory mold. And so here I just have a final slide about the reauthorization. Noëlle had mentioned it a little bit, but we are in the midst of reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act, which many folks on the Hill are very confident is going to happen this year. We are very happy that many of our asks are being included as part of the reauthorization. So you'll see, hopefully, an expansion of VAWA to cover more federal housing programs. The reauthorization establishes a position at HUD called a VAWA director. This person will have a myriad of job responsibilities, including coordination among federal agencies to implement VAWA, creating a compliance program, and providing technical assistance. You also see in this reauthorization that there's a lot that is being required for HUD to do. So in addition to the VAWA director, we also are requiring that HUD partner with domestic violence and sexual assault experts to develop mandatory trainings for staff of housing providers. It requires HUD regional office to play proactive roles to facilitate emergency transfers. That is not happening right now. Many HUD regional offices are not even familiar with VAWA and what VAWA requires, which is really, really disappointing and scary. The reauthorization would also create and appropriate funds for what's called a National VAWA Victims Relocation Pool vouchers. So this is a pool of vouchers specifically for the purpose of emergency transfers. What we have found is that transfers right now, as they are talked about in the current VAWA, are not working. And what people really need, survivors really need, is a voucher that they moves with them when domestic violence or other kinds of violence happen and they need to move with the housing assistance to find alternative safe housing. So it would create a pool of that. The VAWA reauthorization would also ensure early lease terminations without penalty. So this is also related to emergency transfers. When survivors need to get out of their leases early, oftentimes they're being penalized by housing providers because they're ending their leases. And like I mentioned before, only half the states have laws that protect survivors from these penalties when they end their leases for safety reasons. And also the law would ensure that survivors can contact emergency services or 911 without any kind of penalty. So I'll stop right there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you. So we have a couple questions in the queue. I also see a hand. I have a question. Let me start with a question that's been sitting in our queue for a little while from Alyssa Wilson Coleman. Under the Biden plan, is there a plan to look at equal housing opportunities for felons who are also needing safe housing and are continually marginalized? And I'll just add to that, it's not just felons. Anybody with any kind of criminal record can have problems in the housing market. So what specifically might the Biden administration be planning to do in that regard?
Let me take this.
Sure.
So I would say that on principle, President Biden and his Vice President Harris's plans are very broad, and this isn't a level of detail that we would have seen in the Build Back Better plan. We are actually coincidentally working with Senator Ron Wyden right now on a proposal to address housing issues for people reentering from the prison or jail system. So there is an appetite in Congress, and there has been a long-standing interest. There's also the Fair Chance at Housing Act that came out of the House from Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and also from former Senator and now Vice President Kamala Harris last Congress, that does some different reentry efforts as well. So certainly there's an appetite on the Hill. And there's an awareness at HUD, and Peggy Bailey, who is the senior advisor on rental assistance, also comes with a lot of expertise in this area. So I would say that it's a ripe area for activity, but it doesn't reach the level of, say, like a White House initiative.
Any other thoughts? Okay. Second question is from Rachel Baker. A timing question. Any best guesses when the analysis of fair housing, which is part of the AFFH rule that we expect to come out again from the Biden administration? AFFH is affirmatively furthering fair housing, and that includes as part of it. I know this gets confusing if you talk about it in a law school class. AFFH includes AFH, which is the analysis of fair housing, that is part of implementing the AFFH rule. When do we think that will return for jurisdictions to perform?
I have some thoughts, and I didn't know if I saw David reaching for the.
Go for it, Noëlle.
There's still a fair amount of concern over how we have to approach the return of AFFH. Although the although the Trump administration went a little bit out of the Administrative Procedures Act on how they implemented the new rule, it appears most experts seem to believe we have to go through a full notice of proposed rulemaking process. Again, that's a really complicated issue. I'm not sure if they're teaching that at Willamette these days, but
yes, in administrative law.
Amazing. Because of that sort of procedural hurdle, it's most likely that we will have to go through a notice of proposed rulemaking, a public comment period, all of the different OMB review aspects before we see the reinstatement. You know, there are talks that are happening far above my level. There's the possibility that some of the tools could simply be placed back online, but I would expect, from what I understand at this time, that we'll sort of have to procedurally wait to return to.
I think that's right. This is something that's going to get a lot of attention very early, but in terms of actual implementation, it could take a year or more.
And okay. Oh, I see. Right on point. We have a question from Robert Liberty, who was one of our panelists yesterday. Will the revised AFFH apply to MPOs, which I believe are metropolitan planning organizations, who are often the arrangement of different governmental officials from a local metropolitan area who funnel transportation funds to different projects? Any thoughts on that?
This is a cart way before a horse. There, you know, I would say the key players who really, advocacy-wise, who really believe in AFFH and believe in the reinstatement of AFFH are still having the conversations about whether or not now is an appropriate political time to attempt to zhuzh or push or update anything. So I'm not sure that there will be advocacy for change or improvement to the AFFH rule, let alone what those changes or improvements might be. So I'm still sort of operating on the principle that we get the Obama era rule back, but that's up in the air.
And relatedly, we had a question from Robert Liberty about, well, wondering how Infrastructure Week would play out, and I wonder if you have thoughts on how that may impact, for good or for ill, hopes about money spent on housing, and then also asking about a more specific focus on the terrible housing situation for Native Americans living in cities, which is a particular problem in Portland.
So I can take the transportation piece. I really like your question, Robert, especially your phrasing of billions for highway improvements to shave a few minutes of long distance commutes and further facilitate suburban growth and housing segregation. You have nailed it. That is exactly the issue that we struggle with, because in fact, when we invest money in transportation infrastructure in communities that use zoning and development fees to keep people from building affordable housing, we are literally underwriting the longer commuter times to protect essentially segregationist zoning policies. And you see this as much or more in communities in California that often consider themselves very progressive than you do around the country. And this is a big problem. I know that, if you're building affordable housing in the Bay Area, it's typical for you to spend $100,000 per unit before you actually even apply for a zoning permit in a development fee. So we've got to address these issues. There's a lot of issues around zoning, and the part of the problem here is that we will occasionally say, well, you're not going to get your community development block grant money unless you change these zoning rules. And guess what? If you don't want to do community development, telling you can't have money to do community development may not be the most effective incentive. So there's a very broad and growing focus on how do you tie transportation to funding to many of these local changes, which are not part of the federal government, but certainly have an impact on how the federal government money is spent. And there's a variety of legislation that's being talked about. One of many is the Yes in My Backyard bill. And there's also provisions in the new infrastructure bill being drafted and talked about for the next reconciliation bill. So I think this is something that's really come to a head this year, and there's an increasing understanding that if you're going to create incentives to change local regulations that contribute to racial segregation, you need to do it through transportation dollars, not CDBG or home.
Any thoughts on Native Americans in urban areas? Well, let me wrap that into my question, which is, I don't know how many of our panelists have read Richard Rothstein's Color of Law, or were here for his talk yesterday, but he spoke about what he saw as the responsibility of every American citizen to remedy discrimination that had been effectuated by the government. That's a very compelling view. I'm not sure that's the view of the current majority of the Supreme Court, though, who tend to view harms more individually than in a group way. That's just my guess. We have a couple of newer justices, Kavanaugh and Barrett, who haven't really decided a case in this realm. I guess Gorsuch, too. But if you look at some of the prior decisions of Roberts and Thomas and Alito, they take a more kind of individual-based view of rectifying discriminatory harms. I was struck by something Noëlle said. She said, anti-poverty can't be seen as the same as anti-racist. We have to be more specifically anti-racist. And one of the ways to do that is to use race as a tool. But we have a Supreme Court that I think is probably fairly skeptical of that. This may also come up in the gender context, Karlo, with respect to the Violence Against Women Act and some of its enforcement tools, which, again, the Supreme Court may be skeptical of remedies only for one gender, not the other, or, and not sort of more broadly equal approaches. And I think this gets at the potential tension between equality and equity. And equity is a term people are using very broadly now, but it isn't very often defined. The Biden administration did define it in its executive order, and they defined it in a way that I found kind of strikingly similar to equality. It seemed to me to be kind of a little bit of a narrower definition than some advocates use the term. So how do we see the equity equality issue playing out, and then the rubber potentially hitting the road with the Supreme Court in terms of using race as a tool or gender?
I'll just chime in here a little bit about equity and what that means. I mean, I think generally speaking, people understand it as being equity is different people need different things depending on what their needs are. And so folks might not be getting the same thing across the board, but in order to get to the point of true equality, we need to be giving people different resources and opportunities. But I think part of what the conversation has not really focused on is who are we asking what they need? Because so much of the time policy is imposed on folks. And I am thinking about people of color, especially Native Americans, where for generations, federal policy, state and local policies have been imposed on them without their voices and their opinion as to, is this really appropriate for me, for my tribe, for my people? And so I would just emphasize that a big chunk of this equity conversation about racial equality and what folks need has to be centered on the people, not just what policymakers want or think that they want, but actually what the people want. You know, and that definitely gets into some of like the survivor-centered work, but like people-centered work that is happening right now about really going back to the people and saying, is this really what you want? So I would just want to focus people on that.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, you know, thinking about the court, this is definitely something that we spent a lot of time thinking through in the area of how to better target federal programs to address racial inequities. And I think that we definitely want to make sure that we do it in a way that is not reversed by the court. That's obviously a big loss. The court, you know, when you look at the history of the court, you know, you have courts that really lean into policy change, like the Warren Court. You have courts that I consider more neutral, like the Rehnquist Court, in terms of, you know, trying to find that balance. And then the Roberts Court, particularly with the rise of, you know, the originalist perspective, which is fairly new. And there's a lot of risk there. My hope is that this new construction of thinking about this really more around providing benefits to people who didn't get them that already have been received by others, rather than reversing past discrimination. It's a subtle difference, but I think it may have some impact. And also, I think you can't really assess the state of the court on some of these issues, given the way the general mood of the country can shift underneath a conservative court. And, you know, the biggest example of that for me is gay marriage. This is an issue that a year earlier, I think most people would not have predicted that the court would take the stand it did on gay marriage. And so sometimes the court may follow a change in national mood much quicker than we expect. I hope that's going to be the case in the area of racial equity. I do think that some of the new justices are capable of surprising us, but we could be wrong, and we just don't know yet. So I'm going to keep an open mind because I don't have a choice.
Well, court packing would be a choice, but that's a different Noëlle.
It is a different subject. We need another hour for that one.
Yeah.
I would echo this sort of definition of equity and note that Senator Cotton from Arkansas, which tells you everything you need to know about where his last name and his perspective tell you everything you need to know about where he's coming from on this, has frequently asked the question of equity versus equality for President Biden's nominees. Specifically, he asked Secretary Designate Fudge where she stood on equity versus equality. And she defined it in the perspective of housing. And she said, if my credit score is the same as yours, if my bank account looks the same as yours, if I have the same, amount of down, or if I have all the same sort of qualifications, education, career history, et cetera, but I don't have generational down payment coming my way, we still don't have equity in how we approach home ownership. And obviously, he had his gotcha moment to understand whether or not she then believed that equity was necessary, and her answer was simply yes. And so while I don't think that the Biden administration has done a great job from a public messaging perspective of saying, we actually do define equity as distinct from equality, and we are committed to, we're not stuttering, we're not mincing our words, we're committed to the equity. I do think that the nominees are showing a lot of commitment in their individual spaces. The hiring in some corners is better than others to show that commitment as well. And so while the courts are a major question, I do think that the machinations of trying to move legislation or regulatory policy forward and then having to bring those suits where we challenge the issue means that the national conversation, or what I would call in politics the Overton window, is still shifting. And so we do have this hard work ahead of us. And as David said, like, I don't love the position of waiting for a surprise from a historically conservative justice, but I do believe that that we are in a moment where that definition and that distinction will become important, and where you'll have to sort of say where you land. And it does tend to bend that arc of justice, but it might be much longer than we would hope.
I think we need to be really mindful of how we're heard when we're advocating for these things. And it's very easy to talk about things like racial equity and white privilege in a way that makes the person who's hearing you sound like they've done something wrong. And sometimes we're very clear in saying, yeah, you've done something wrong just for being who you are. And it's very hard to get past the conversation. I know generally when people tell me I'm wrong, it's really hard for me to say, oh yeah, I should take a look at that. Not my first response. So I do believe that we need to help people understand that there are benefits that you've gotten that weren't given to everyone, and there's a long-term impact for that. One of the things that I think is most important in the housing space is not just the down payment, the daddy down payment loan, I like to call it, which, people can't get if there isn't family wealth. And there's a lot of people who talk about having put 20% down on their home, who in fact did not put 20% down. They got half of that from their parents. That's not the same. But there's also the impact of multi-generational home ownership, of just the perception of yourself as a potential homeowner, or your ability to call a father or a mother or an aunt or an uncle and say, hey, this is making me feel uncomfortable in this process. Is this normal? And they can say, oh yeah, that is, or no, you don't have to pay to get the documents stapled. Those are the kinds of things that provide confidence and move the process forward. And if you're a first generation homeowner, or home buyer, you just don't get that. And so I think that we need to, and I also think that people who are resistant to this, a little gratitude goes a long way. Doesn't mean you did something wrong, but you can be grateful for the benefits that you've had. And I think that's often lacking from the debate as well.
So we have just about, we just have like a minute left. There is somebody who's had their hand up for a long time in our audience, named EHT. Did you want to ask your question? Well, not hearing that question. We have 2 questions in the queue. I'll give our panelists 10 or 20 seconds to answer them. Thoughts on the Booker-Clyburn Home Act, and an additional question about more regional level planning for housing. Real quick, anybody?
I will say David's right. I was too mean to Tom Cotton.
I don't think that. I definitely don't think that, but that's a separate issue too.
So regional level planning, one of the things that we're actually really, really pushing for is the ability for PHAs to form consortia. I think that, you know, when we have a voucher conversation and we talk about mobility and or choice for tenants, it's really important to say that mobility doesn't just mean like, oh, here's where the PHA can serve you, and those are the limits of your ability to expand your reach. And so I think, yes, and then there are probably much more broad examples of the regionalization of planning and the attempts to say, like, we just have a lot of PHAs, and that's not necessarily the best thing for tenants. And we have a lot of small catchment areas, or, you know, small ways that we define things, and not necessarily, it's a lot of overhead. Booker Clyburn, I would assume that the bill comes back to the 117th Congress. It, in my opinion, needs some improvement. We've offered feedback regularly. And as I said previously, the 116th Congress was about showing that Democrats were working and showing that legislation was possible. But, you know, we didn't have this sort of broad ability to take votes. And so I think that my hope is that now feedback is a little bit more incorporated, and that people are a little more thoughtful about their potential for bills becoming laws. And that's not a dig at all on Booker and Clyburn. What they're trying to do here is incredible. It's just, for us as the National Housing Law Project, our intent is always to kind of redline through every detail. The "and" here is going to be problematic, and "or" would be exceptional, you know, those sorts of things. And so there are a lot of 116th Congress bills that I think are coming back, and we're really working to try to slow the staff a little bit and say, let's really talk through the implications of what you're trying to do, how it might intersect. I remember, I think David mentioned source of income protection being important. And one of the things I feel really passionate about is that we have an Evictions Crisis Act that comes from Senators Portman and Bennett. There are pieces of it in the House, and working to put source of income protections into that type of emergency funding and ensuring that it is useful. And then also we would be standing up the protections to make sure that vouchers are usable across the board. And so really working to say some of these policies without another protection aren't as strong as they could be, and how do we sort of incorporate?
Well, thank you. This has been great. We've gotten just a couple minutes over, so I will let everyone take a break, but I don't think the people in the crowd can do the normal clapping on Zoom emoticon, but I'm sure they would. And so please join me, at least virtually, in thanking David, Karlo, and Noëlle for an excellent presentation.